The autumn sun was setting behind the towering courthouse building, casting long shadows across the parking garage. Judge Patricia Williams let out a tired sigh as she gathered her belongings, happy to finally head home after a demanding day of back-to-back hearings. She had already changed out of her formal robes into more comfortable clothes, a simple blue sweater and black pants, something she always looked forward to at day's end. As she walked through the dim garage, her comfortable flats making soft echoes against the concrete, she heard raised voices bouncing off the walls. Following the sound, she noticed a police officer standing over a young black man who was leaning against his car. The officer's stance was aggressive, his hand resting deliberately on his belt as he fired questions at the young man. Patricia slowed her pace, her judicial instincts kicking in. The young man's body language showed fear. He kept his hands visible and spoke softly, trying to explain something about waiting for his sister who worked in the courthouse. But the officer kept cutting him off, his voice getting louder with each interruption. She set her briefcase down quietly and pulled out her phone, staying a reasonable distance away, but making sure she could clearly see and hear what was happening. The young man noticed her presence, his eyes briefly meeting hers with a mix of relief and worry. That's when the officer spun around, his face twisted with annoyance. "Move along," he barked, pointing aggressively at the exit. "This is police business." Patricia stood her ground, her voice calm but firm from years of courtroom experience. "I'm just observing to ensure everything is being handled properly." The officer took 3 quick steps toward her, his boots heavy against the concrete. "I said move along. You're interfering with an investigation." His face was getting red now, and small beads of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the cool air. "I'm simply standing here," Patricia replied, keeping her tone measured. "As a citizen, I have the right to observe police interactions in public spaces." She adjusted her grip on her phone, making sure it was recording, something she'd learned was sometimes necessary in today's world. The officer's eyes narrowed as he noticed the phone. "Put that away right now," he demanded, moving even closer. His name tag caught the fluorescent light. Officer J. Barrett. Patricia didn't move, didn't flinch. 20 years on the bench had taught her how to handle tense situations. "Officer Barrett, I'm Judge Patricia Williams of the..." But before she could finish, something unthinkable happened. The officer's face contorted with rage, and in a split second, he spat directly at her. Time seemed to slow as she felt the warm saliva hit her cheek, the utter shock and disbelief washing over her like ice water. The young man gasped, quickly pulling out his own phone. A courthouse security guard, who had been doing his rounds, came running toward them. 2 court clerks who were leaving for the day stopped in their tracks, witnesses to an act that would soon shake the entire city's police department to its core. As Patricia slowly wiped her face with a tissue from her purse, she maintained perfect composure, a skill learned from countless high-pressure courtroom moments. Her voice was steady as she looked directly at Officer Barrett, whose face was beginning to show the first flickers of realization. "Officer Barrett," she said clearly, making sure everyone could hear, "I am Judge Patricia Williams of the Superior Court, and you have just committed assault against a sitting judge." The color drained from Barrett's face as the weight of his actions crashed down upon him. The parking garage fell deadly silent, except for the quiet whir of phones recording what would soon become a viral symbol of police misconduct and the abuse of power. The tense silence in the parking garage lasted only seconds before Officer Barrett tried to regain control of the situation. His earlier confidence crumbled as he fumbled with his radio, calling for backup. But his voice trembled slightly, a far cry from his aggressive tone just moments before. "Ma'am, you need to understand," he started, his words coming out fast and defensive. "You were interfering with an official police investigation. I repeatedly asked you to." "Save it for your supervisor." Judge Williams cut him off, her dignity intact despite the tissue still clutched in her hand. The young man who had been initially questioned was now standing straighter, his phone steady as he continued recording. More courthouse employees had gathered, creating a small crowd of witnesses. A security guard named Tom, who had worked at the courthouse for 15 years and knew the judge well, stepped forward. "Judge Williams, would you like me to call the police chief directly?" he asked, his face showing both concern and barely contained anger. The judge nodded, her mind already working through the legal implications of what had just happened. She pulled out her own phone again, this time dialing a number she knew by heart. "Get me District Attorney Chen," she said firmly into the phone. "Yes, it's an emergency." Officer Barrett's face shifted between fear and defiance. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," he said, his voice rising again. "Every day we deal with people, though." "Officer," Judge Williams interrupted, her voice sharp enough to make him step back. "The only pressure you're under right now is the weight of your own actions. Spitting on anyone is assault. Spitting on a judge." She let the implications hang in the air. More police cars were pulling into the garage now, their lights painting the concrete walls and flashing red and blue. The young man who had been Barrett's original target spoke up for the first time since the incident. "I got it all on video, Your Honor. Everything from when he first stopped me for suspicious behavior, which was just me waiting for my sister." Two senior officers approached quickly, taking in the scene. The first one, a sergeant with gray hair and a lined face, looked from Barrett to the judge and back again. "Officer Barrett, step away and wait by your vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The second officer, a lieutenant, turned to Judge Williams. "Your Honor, I apologize for this incident. We'll need your statement, and I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated." Judge Williams stood tall, her presence commanding respect despite her casual clothes. "Lieutenant, what happened here today goes beyond a single incident. This speaks to a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. Officer Barrett didn't just see a citizen observing his actions. He saw a black woman daring to question his authority, and his response was to assault her." The crowd of witnesses had grown larger, and several people nodded in agreement. The young man's sister had arrived, still in her courthouse clerk uniform, and rushed to his side. She looked horrified when he showed her the video. "I want every piece of footage from this garage," Judge Williams continued, addressing both police officers. "I want Officer Barrett's body cam, all security camera footage, and copies of every video taken by witnesses. This isn't going away with a simple apology or a suspension." Barrett stood by his car, his earlier bravado completely gone. He kept wiping his forehead, watching as his career crumbled around him. The chief of police was already on his way, and news vans were pulling up outside the garage, their reporters having caught wind of the incident through courthouse staff's social media posts. The sergeant turned to Judge Williams again. "Would you like to press charges right now, Your Honor?" She looked directly at Barrett as she answered, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, and this is just the beginning. Sometimes it takes a spark to light the fire of change." Officer Barrett just provided that spark. Within minutes, the parking garage had transformed into something that looked like a movie scene. Police cars lined the entrance, their lights still flashing against the concrete walls. News reporters gathered at the edge of the garage, held back by yellow police tape that had been quickly put up. Judge Williams sat in a comfortable chair that someone had brought from her office, speaking quietly with the police chief who had arrived in record time. His face was grim as he watched the video for the third time on the young man's phone. The courthouse security team had already pulled up the security camera footage on a laptop, showing multiple angles of the incident. "This is worse than I imagined," the police chief muttered, running a hand over his face. He was a veteran of the force with 30 years of experience, but he'd never dealt with something quite like this. Officer Barrett had 2 complaints filed against him last month, but nothing this serious. The young man who had been Barrett's original target stood nearby with his sister, giving his statement to a detective. I was just waiting for my sister like I do every Tuesday, he explained. She works late organizing the court files. I always park in the same spot to pick her up. His sister nodded, still in her courthouse uniform. He has a valid parking permit, she added, holding up the bright blue tag. He's been picking me up for months. Everyone here knows him. Meanwhile, Officer Barrett sat in the back of a police car, watching his world fall apart through the window. His union representative had arrived and was speaking with him, but even from a distance, anyone could see the rep's frustrated body language. The garage was now full of courthouse employees who had stayed late to give statements. The security guard, Tom, was showing another detective the regular pickup routine, explaining how the young man was a familiar face to everyone who worked the evening shift. Your Honor, the police chief said, turning back to Judge Williams. We're prepared to take him into custody right now. The DA is drafting the charges as we speak. Judge Williams straightened in her chair, her composure still perfect despite everything that had happened. Before you do that, I want to address something. She stood up and walked over to where Barrett sat in the police car. The union rep stepped aside as she approached. Barrett looked up at her through the car window, his face a mix of fear and shame. Judge Williams motioned for an officer to open the door. Officer Barrett, she said, her voice steady and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. I want you to understand something. What happened today isn't just about you and me. It's about every person who has ever been mistreated by someone with authority. It's about every officer who abuses their power and thinks they can get away with it. Barrett started to speak, but she held up her hand. I'm not finished. You didn't just spit on a judge today. You spit on the very idea of justice. You showed everyone exactly why people are afraid of the police. And now you're going to be an example of what happens when that power is finally held accountable. The garage had gone quiet, everyone listening to her words. Even the reporters at the edge of the tape had stopped shouting questions, trying to catch what she was saying. Take him in, she said to the chief, turning away from the car. And make sure every piece of evidence is properly logged. We're going to do this by the book. As Barrett was led out of the car to be formally arrested, Judge Williams turned to the young man and his sister. I'm sorry you had to go through this, she said softly. But your quick thinking in recording everything may help make real changes. The police chief was already on his phone, calling for a press conference. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights creating strange shadows in the garage. Social media was exploding with the first videos of the incident, and the courthouse phone lines were lighting up with calls from major news networks. It's going to be a long night, Judge Williams said to no one in particular, watching as Barrett was led away in handcuffs. But maybe, just maybe, it'll be the night things finally start to change. The next morning, the story was everywhere. People couldn't stop talking about it at bus stops, in coffee shops, and especially in the courthouse hallways. Local news stations played the video on repeat, and national networks had picked up the story overnight. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews, all hoping to catch a glimpse of Judge Williams as she arrived for work. Inside the police department's internal affairs office, investigators were working overtime. They had spread everything out on a large conference table. Barrett's personnel file, witness statements, and multiple angles of video footage from phones and security cameras. The lead investigator, a veteran officer with thick glasses and graying hair, shook his head as he reviewed Barrett's record. Look at this, he said to his partner, pushing a file across the table. 3 complaints in the past year about aggressive behavior, all filed by people of color, all marked as resolved with no real investigation. His voice carried the weight of disappointment and frustration. Their investigation was taking them deeper than just one incident in a parking garage. They found a pattern in Barrett's dash cam footage from previous months, a tendency to pull over minorities more frequently, a harsh tone that wasn't present when dealing with other citizens, and body camera footage that was mysteriously turned off during crucial moments. At her desk, Judge Williams was reviewing emails from other judges across the country. Many shared similar stories that had gone unreported, fearing it would affect their positions or not be taken seriously. Her phone kept buzzing with messages of support from community leaders and civil rights organizations. The young man from the parking garage had become an important part of the investigation, too. His clear, steady video had captured everything from the moment Barrett first approached him. He sat in an interview room with two detectives, describing how things unfolded. "I've been picking up my sister from work for months," he explained, pointing at his parking permit. "But Officer Barrett wouldn't even let me show it to him. It was like he'd already decided I was doing something wrong." Meanwhile, in another part of the building, police leadership held an emergency meeting. The chief stood at the front of the room, addressing his command staff. "This isn't just about one officer anymore," he said, his voice firm. "This is about our whole system. How many other complaints have we brushed aside? How many warning signs have we ignored?" The room was quiet. Everyone knew he was right. On the wall-mounted TV, a national news anchor was discussing the broader implications of the incident. Social media hashtags were trending, and people were sharing their own stories of encounters with police. Back in her chambers, Judge Williams received a visit from the district attorney. They sat across from each other, drinking coffee and discussing the case. "The evidence is overwhelming," the DA said, spreading photos across the desk. "But it's not just about getting a conviction. This could be a chance for real change in how we handle police misconduct." Judge Williams nodded, looking at a framed photo on her wall, herself as a young lawyer, full of hope about changing the system from within. "We need to make sure this case sets a precedent," she said, "not just for punishment, but for reform." Outside her window, she could see protesters gathering peacefully in the courthouse square. They carried signs calling for justice and police accountability. But unlike many protests, these weren't just young activists. There were people of all ages and backgrounds, including other police officers in plain clothes. The investigation was moving quickly, but thoroughly. Internal Affairs had pulled every case Barrett had handled in the past 5 years. They were interviewing his fellow officers, looking for anyone who might have witnessed previous incidents. Some officers were reluctant to speak at first, but as the evidence mounted, more began to come forward. "We can't undo what happened," Judge Williams said to the DA, standing up to look out at the gathering crowd. "But we can make sure it leads to something meaningful. Sometimes it takes one moment, one incident, to open everyone's eyes to a problem that's been there all along." 3 days after the incident, the city was buzzing with energy. People couldn't go anywhere without hearing about what had happened in that parking garage. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, not angry or violent, but determined. They held signs with messages like "Justice Matters" and "Respect the Law," all of it. Local business owners had put up signs supporting Judge Williams in their windows. The coffee shop across from the courthouse even renamed their house blend Justice Brew for the week. The owner, a small woman with kind eyes who had been serving courthouse employees for 20 years, spoke to a news reporter about why she felt compelled to show support. "Judge Williams comes in here every morning," she said, wiping down her counter. "She knows everyone's names, asks about their families. She treats everyone with respect, something Officer Barrett should learn about." At the police station, phones rang nonstop. People from all over the country called to share their thoughts. Some told their own stories of facing discrimination, while others, including retired police officers, called to say how important it was to address these issues. The police chief held a press conference in the station's briefing room, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. "We've received hundreds of emails and calls," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Many people are sharing similar experiences. We can't ignore this anymore. It's time for real change." In her office, Judge Williams watched the press conference on TV while sorting through letters that had arrived for her. Some came from other judges across the country, others from ordinary citizens. A group of law students had sent a handmade card thanking her for standing up for justice. Her assistant brought in another stack of messages. "Your Honor," she said, "the governor's office called again. They want you to head a new commission on police reform." Judge Williams picked up one of the letters. It was from a 12-year-old girl who wrote about wanting to become a judge someday. "You showed me that judges can be brave," the girl had written in careful handwriting. Meanwhile, at community centers across the city, people gathered to talk about their experiences with law enforcement. These weren't angry meetings, but thoughtful discussions about how to make things better. Police officers who believed in doing the right thing came to listen and share their perspectives too. The young man from the parking garage had become something of a local hero. People praised him for staying calm and recording the incident. He spoke at one of these community meetings, his sister by his side. "I was scared," he admitted to the crowd, "but I knew I had to record it. Not to get anyone in trouble, but to show the truth. Sometimes that's all we can do. Show the truth and hope people pay attention." Social media couldn't get enough of the story. The hashtag Judge William Strong was trending, with people sharing their own stories of standing up against injustice. But it wasn't just about one incident anymore. People were talking about real changes they wanted to see. Local teachers used the incident as a lesson in civics classes, talking about rights, responsibilities, and respect. One high school debate team even centered their state competition argument around police accountability, using this case as their main example. At the end of the week, Judge Williams visited a local youth center where kids from the neighborhood gathered after school. She didn't come to talk about the incident, but to listen to their experiences and hopes for the future. "Your Honor," one teenage boy asked during the visit, "weren't you scared when it happened?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," she said. "It means doing what's right even when you are scared. And sometimes, standing up for what's right helps others find their courage too." As she left the youth center, she noticed something different in the way people looked at her. Not just respect for her position as a judge, but admiration for standing up for what was right. The incident in the parking garage had become more than just a news story. It had become a catalyst for change. The courthouse was unusually quiet that morning as the legal proceedings against Officer Barrett began. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, with people lined up in the hallway hoping to get in. A special judge from another county had been brought in to handle the case, making sure everything was fair and unbiased. Barrett sat at the defendant's table, wearing a dark suit instead of his police uniform. He looked different now, smaller somehow, without his badge and authority. His attorney, a well-known police union lawyer, shuffled through papers beside him. The special prosecutor, brought in from a neighboring city, stood up to present the case. She was known for being tough but fair, with a reputation for handling sensitive cases. "What happened in that parking garage wasn't just an assault," she began. "It was an abuse of power that shows a pattern of behavior." Large screens in the courtroom displayed the evidence. First, the security camera footage, then the cell phone videos. The young man who had recorded everything sat in the front row, watching as his video played for the court. His sister held his hand tightly. One by one, witnesses took the stand. The security guard described what he saw that day. Other courthouse employees shared their observations. But the most powerful testimony came from unexpected places. Other officers who had worked with Barrett over the years. A senior officer, his voice heavy with emotion, described incidents he had witnessed but never reported. "I knew it was wrong," he admitted, "but I told myself it wasn't my business. I was part of the problem by staying silent." During a break in the proceedings, people gathered in small groups in the hallway, talking in hushed voices. A retired police officer spoke with some young law students, sharing his perspective. "This case isn't just about one bad officer," he explained. "It's about changing a culture that protects wrong behavior." Judge Williams watched from her own courtroom upstairs, following the proceedings on a live feed. She would testify later, but for now, she observed as justice took its course. Her clerk brought her updates throughout the day, sharing how people in the community were reacting. Back in the courtroom, Barrett's previous conduct record was presented. Complaints that had been brushed aside, warnings that had been ignored, and a clear pattern of targeting minorities emerged. His attorney tried to argue these were irrelevant to the current case, but the special judge disagreed. The court needs to understand the full context, the judge explained, his voice firm but fair. This incident didn't happen in isolation. During lunch break, news reporters interviewed people outside the courthouse. An elderly woman who had been watching the proceedings shared her thoughts. "I've lived in this city for 60 years, she said, adjusting her glasses. It's about time we faced these problems openly. The afternoon session brought more revelations. Internal Affairs investigators presented their findings. Text messages showing Barrett's prejudiced attitudes, dash cam footage of other concerning incidents, and testimonies from citizens who had faced similar treatment but had been afraid to come forward. Barrett's attorney tried to paint a picture of a stressed officer who made a mistake, but the evidence told a different story. The special prosecutor methodically built her case, showing how this wasn't a single bad decision but part of a larger problem. As the day drew to a close, the young man from the parking garage spoke with some high school students who had come to watch the proceedings. "When I started recording that day," he said, "I never thought it would lead to all this. But sometimes standing up for what's right can change things in ways you never expected." Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. People lingered, discussing what they had witnessed. There was a feeling in the air, not of victory or celebration, but of something important happening, of change slowly but surely taking shape. The disciplinary hearing room felt smaller than usual as Officer Barrett faced the police review board. Gone was his usual confident stance, replaced by slumped shoulders and nervous hands that couldn't stay still. 5 senior officers sat behind a long table, their faces showing no emotion as they reviewed the evidence one final time. "Officer Barrett," the board chairman began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Today you have a chance to explain your actions. Not just what happened in the parking garage, but the pattern of behavior we've uncovered. We're listening." Barrett cleared his throat, looking down at his prepared statement. But as he started to read, his hands shaking, he suddenly put the paper down. I can't read this," he said quietly. "It's full of excuses, and I'm tired of making excuses." The room grew even quieter. His union representative shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Nobody had expected this. "I've spent weeks thinking about what happened," Barrett continued, his voice growing stronger. "At first, I was angry. Angry at Judge Williams for recording me. Angry at everyone for not understanding the pressure we're under. But then I started reading the letters." He pulled out a stack of envelopes from his briefcase. "People from our community wrote to me, not with hate, but sharing their experiences. How they felt afraid during traffic stops. How they taught their kids special rules for dealing with police. One letter was from an old woman who said she prays every time her grandson drives to work." Barrett's voice cracked slightly. "I always told myself I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone fairly, but watching those videos of myself, reading my own text messages, I didn't recognize that person, but it was me." The review board members exchanged glances. One of them, a veteran officer with 30 years of service, leaned forward. "What changed?" she asked simply. "My daughter did a school project about the incident," Barrett replied, pulling out a wrinkled paper. "She interviewed her classmates about how they felt about police. Reading what these kids wrote, some were scared of me, of what I represent. My own daughter had to ask me if what they said was true." Outside the hearing room, a small crowd had gathered, other officers, courthouse staff, and community members. Through the glass windows, they could see Barrett standing there, no longer the intimidating figure from the parking garage video. "I know I can't keep my badge," he continued, squaring his shoulders. "I don't deserve to. But maybe by admitting what I did wrong, by really facing it, I can help change things. Those sensitivity training sessions we joke about, we need to take them seriously. That implicit bias training we sleep through, it matters." The board chairman nodded slowly, making notes. "Officer Barrett, you understand that what you're saying here will be part of the official record." "Yes, sir. It should be. We can't fix problems we won't admit to having." As Barrett spoke, a young officer in the hallway listened intently. Later, he would tell his partner that this was the day he started looking at his own behavior differently. The hearing continued for hours. Barrett answered questions about specific incidents, about his attitudes, about moments when he could have made different choices. He didn't make excuses anymore. Each admission seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, even as it confirmed the board's inevitable decision. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, the board reached their conclusion. Barrett's badge and gun would be turned in. His career in law enforcement was over. But something unexpected had happened during that hearing. A moment of genuine reflection that would ripple through the department. Walking out of the building for the last time, Barrett passed Judge Williams in the hallway. He stopped, meeting her eyes for the first time since that day in the garage. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that change starts with facing the truth about ourselves. The morning of the final hearing dawned bright and clear. The courthouse steps were crowded, but the mood was different from the angry protests of weeks before. People spoke in hushed, expectant tones, waiting to hear the outcome that would affect their entire community. Inside the main courtroom, every seat was filled. Judge Williams sat in the front row, hands folded calmly in her lap. The young man from the parking garage and his sister sat nearby, along with courthouse employees who had witnessed everything that day. Barrett entered wearing a simple gray suit, looking more human than he had in his uniform. His family sat behind him, his wife holding their daughter's hand tightly. The girl had drawn something in her notebook, occasionally glancing up at her father with confused eyes. The special prosecutor stood, addressing the court one final time. "Your Honor, we have reached a plea agreement. But this isn't just about punishment. It's about making real changes." She outlined the terms. Barrett would plead guilty to assault and civil rights violations. His sentence included community service, mandatory counseling, and participation in police reform programs. But most importantly, he would speak at police training sessions about his experience and what he had learned. "The defendant has shown genuine remorse," the prosecutor continued. "He's agreed to work with community organizations to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and citizens. Sometimes, the best lessons come from acknowledging our worst mistakes." The judge, a respected figure brought in from another district, listened carefully. When Barrett stood to speak, the room fell silent. "I've done a lot of thinking," he began, his voice steady but humble. "About power, about prejudice, about the trust people place in us when they pin on a badge. I broke that trust. Not just on that day in the garage, but many times before, in smaller ways I didn't want to admit." He turned to face Judge Williams directly. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to help fix what I helped break. Every officer needs to understand that respect isn't about fear or power. It's about serving our community, all of our community." The civil settlement was announced next. Barrett would pay damages, but more importantly, the police department agreed to major reforms. New training programs, community oversight boards, and clear consequences for misconduct would be implemented. A small group of police officers attended the hearing in civilian clothes. One whispered to another, "This could have been any of us. We all need to do better." During a break, the young man who had recorded the incident spoke with some community leaders. "You know what's different about this?" he asked. It's not just about punishing one person. It's about fixing the system that let this happen. Judge Williams finally took the podium to address the court. She spoke not with anger, but with hope for the future. "What happened in that garage was terrible," she said. "But what's happened since then shows how a community can come together to demand better, to be better." She described the changes already taking place. Officers reaching out to community groups, citizens joining police advisory boards, and young people interested in law enforcement for the right reasons. The judge announced his final decision, accepting the plea agreement. But he added something extra, requiring regular progress reports on the reform programs. "This case will stay open," he declared, "until we see real change." As people filed out of the courtroom, Barrett's daughter asked her mother a question that many could hear. "Mom, is Dad still a bad person?" Her mother hugged her close. "No, sweetie. Dad made bad choices, but he's trying to make things right. Sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do." Outside, the afternoon sun painted the courthouse in warm light. People lingered on the steps, talking about what they'd witnessed. It wasn't a happy ending exactly, but it felt like a real beginning. A chance for genuine change in their community. 1 year later, the city had changed in ways both big and small. The morning sun streamed through the windows of a community center where Judge Williams stood before a group of new police recruits. The room was packed, with people even standing along the walls to hear her speak. "A year ago," she began, "something happened that could have torn our community apart. Instead, it brought us together. Today, I want to tell you why that matters for your future as officers." The recruits sat up straighter, many taking notes. Among them was the young man from the parking garage. He had decided to become an officer himself, wanting to be part of the change he helped create. At the back of the room, Barrett sat quietly. He wasn't in uniform anymore, but he had found a new purpose. He traveled to police departments across the country, sharing his story and helping other officers recognize their own biases before they led to similar mistakes. Last week, Judge Williams continued, "A little girl stopped me outside the courthouse. She said she wants to be both a police officer and a judge when she grows up. That wouldn't have happened a year ago. That's what real change looks like." The foundation she had established was making waves. They had created a program where officers and community members met regularly for dinner in each other's homes. Simple conversations over shared meals had done more to build trust than years of formal meetings. Later that afternoon, Judge Williams visited the police academy's new training center. The walls displayed photos of positive interactions between officers and citizens. One showed an officer helping elderly residents during a power outage. Another captured a community basketball game where officers and local teens played together. "Our statistics tell the story," the police chief explained, showing her the latest numbers. "Complaints are down 60%. But more importantly, positive feedback has tripled. Officers are building real relationships in their communities." The young man's sister, still working at the courthouse, had started a program matching police officers with local students for mentoring. "These kids need to see officers as real people," she explained to a news reporter. "And officers need to see these kids as someone's children, not just faces on the street." In the police department break room, a group of officers discussed their recent training session. "Remember how we used to roll our eyes at this stuff?" one asked. "Now it's the most important part of our job, understanding the people we serve." Barrett's daughter had written an essay for school on how her father's mistake had led to positive change. "My dad did something wrong," she wrote, "but then he helped make things better. That's what really matters." The local coffee shop still served Justice Brew, but now it was where officers and community members often met informally. The owner had created a wall of photos showing the positive changes in the neighborhood over the past year. Judge Williams sat in her chambers, looking at a new photo on her wall, herself surrounded by the first graduating class of the Reformed Police Academy. Each cadet had completed intensive community engagement training alongside traditional police work. "Your Honor," her assistant called from the door. "The community council is ready for you." She gathered her papers, smiling at another photo. The young man from the garage, now in his police cadet uniform, standing proudly with his sister and mother at orientation day. Walking through the courthouse halls, Judge Williams passed the spot where security cameras had captured that fateful moment a year ago. Now, a plaque hung there, where change began, a reminder that justice serves all. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, but something was different. Officers walked their beats greeting people by name. Citizens waved back, stopping to chat. Trust was building, slowly but surely, one interaction at a time. Sometimes, Judge Williams often said at speaking engagements, "It takes one moment of darkness to help us find our way to the light." What matters isn't just that moment, it's what we choose to do after.